Thanks everyone for joining us. This is the third in our series of collaborative webinars for Cooperation Buffalo. This is co-hosted by Push Buffalo and Preservation Buffalo Niagara. My name is Michael Highbush. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm a cooperative developer for Cooperation Buffalo, and we are partnered with Push Buffalo. Just a little bit of information about Cooperation Buffalo. We are a team of cooperative business developers and educators, and we work to expand economic democracy by growing the worker co-op community in Buffalo. And I will be co-facilitating this webinar with Bridge Roush and Andrew Del Monte. Bridge, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Bridge. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm the Field Services Coordinator at Preservation Buffalo Niagara. If you're unfamiliar with PBN, our mission is to identify, protect, and promote the unique architectural and historic legacy and connect people to the places they love here in Western New York. And I'll pass it to.
And hi, everybody. My name is Andrew Del Monte. I'm the Director of Cooperative Development for Cooperation Buffalo, and I've gotten to work with these two lovely humans on this webinar series, and I'm very excited about the last one.
Awesome. So this is the final in our series of 3 collaborative webinars. It's called Share the Weight, Transitioning Your Business to Worker Ownership. In this webinar, we will discuss worker ownership as an alternative to shuttering your business due to COVID or due to any other reasons you may want to sell or otherwise move on from your business. There will be breakout groups and chances for you all to contribute, and I'm really excited for what we can come up with together. And before we get started, I'd like to start this webinar by going through some community agreements, and these are intended to make this as efficient and inclusive of a space as possible to respect everyone's time and presence here. So to go through them, the first one is one mic. That just means when someone's talking, everyone else is listening. And in this virtual setting, that includes please mute yourself when you're not speaking, just to reduce some background noise. The next community agreement is all are welcome and make yourself comfortable. This just means prioritize your own needs. Turn your video on if you'd like. If you'd like your video off, that's great too. Please also eat, drink water, get up, do whatever you need to do to make sure that you're prioritizing your own needs this evening. In order to communicate and facilitate conversation, please use the chat box for questions and also to communicate with each other. And if you have any questions throughout this webinar, please feel free to put them in the chat and we will answer them when we can get to them. Another way to communicate is to raise your hand during the discussion sections, and that is in the participants window of your Zoom, and we will be able to get to you that way as well. Next community agreement is assume best intentions and beware of impacts. We're all in this space we have a common goal together to grow cooperation and build a solidarity economy. So if someone says something you don't like, assume that they're making an honest mistake or coming from a positive and good place. And at the same time, be aware of impacts. And that just means try to be aware of what privileges you hold and the way that and what you bring to this space so that we can communicate in a way that is as effective and not in a harmful way if we can. The next thing is we are recording this webinar. If everyone is okay with that, we will distribute it on our YouTube page. Please let us know in the chat. You can direct message us or email us if that is an issue, and then we will make sure that it doesn't get distributed in any way. Please introduce yourselves in the chat. We're one of the reasons why we're doing this is to build community together. So if you feel comfortable, please introduce yourselves so we can all get to know each other. And then finally, we're hoping to share everyone's email just to let them know of upcoming events, things like that. Again, if you have an issue with that, please let us know and we'll make sure you're not included. And throughout this, if there's anything that would help you feel more comfortable or seen in this space, feel free to reach out and we'll do our best to accommodate that. We will be using a shared Google Doc for our breakout groups for our different prompts, which Andrew will be posting in the chat. Thanks in advance for doing that. Next, this webinar is informed by the Principles of Popular Education, or POP Ed. We believe that we all have a lot to learn from each other here, so that while the three of us are facilitating, we all are equals here. It's based on the premise of no one knows everything, but together we know a lot. It is a collective or group process of education where the teacher and students learn together, beginning with the concrete experience of the participants, leading to reflection on that experience in order to affect positive change. So with that out of the way, I will hand it over to Bridge.
All right, so let's just dive in here. Broadly speaking, there's three predominant business ownership models in the US. There's sole proprietorships, partnerships, and corporations. As you can see on that chart there, sole proprietorships make up the largest share of the market. These are businesses that are owned by a single person, and there is no legal separation between that person and their business. They're entitled to all the profits as well as all the debts. Partnerships, those share some of the same characteristics, but the risks and rewards are shared by a larger group of people. Corporations, which is that last set part there, that blue slice of the pie, those are legal entities with clearly defined separation from the owners. The corporation is taxed and liable, not the individuals. I also want to briefly mention limited liability companies, which are business structures where owners are not personally liable for the company's debts or liabilities. LLCs can be used by any one of these ownership models, and we're going to touch on on LLCs some more throughout this presentation. So a quick popcorn question for everyone here on the webinar. What are some pros and cons that you can think of about these types of businesses? And you can either like shout it out, you unmute yourself and like shout it out, or you can type it into the chat. I have a question here from one of the people, like, where do not-for-profits come into play? Those are forms of corporations, like from my experience, yeah. So I will say up front that I'm not a complete expert on this, but yeah, they're corporations. Okay. Can folks think of any pros or cons for any of these models? Yeah. So Aaron mentions like that sole proprietorship means that it's is personal liability, and that's a con, definitely.
Me somehow connected to my email. But it's fine.
I think we can move on to the next slide. Yes, I'll hand it back to Michael.
Thanks, Bridge. So yeah, we are currently living in a moment where many small businesses and business owners are looking to sell or liquidate their business. One of the kind of moments we're living in for the last few years and is going to continue for the next several years is what's known as the silver tsunami, which has been used to describe this time period where business owners in the baby boomer generation are reaching retirement age and looking to sell their businesses or otherwise close down. A few examples in Buffalo are Rotundo's Laundry and Nick's Barbershop, which have both closed in the last year. Many of these businesses are what are known as legacy businesses that have been in communities for decades, and the neighborhoods that they serve have viewed them as a very integral part of their community and would likely benefit from their continued service. Of course, we're also dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, which has visited economic suffering on many people and small businesses for sure. And throughout this webinar, we're going to be discussing how worker ownership can save these local businesses that are closing for all different kinds of reasons. And I'll hand it back to Bridge.
So again, broadly speaking, there's 4 basic worker community ownership models. They're used here in the United States. There's ESOPs, EOTs, LLCs, and cooperatives. And we'll talk about each of those like one by one. So next slide. Before we dive into these models, let's talk a little bit just about the benefits of employee ownership. We're not just speaking philosophically when we talk about how big, awesome, like we think worker ownership is. Years of studies have shown that employee ownership is actually a very smart business decision. Employee-owned companies statistically are more productive and more profitable. And employee-owned companies tend to outlast their non-employee-owned competitors. So, next slide. So what is an ESOP? ESOP is short for Employee Stock Ownership Plans, and these are a popular form of worker ownership models. This is a popular form of worker ownership model where companies provide their employees with stock ownership, often at no upfront cost to the employees. ESOP shares are allocated to employees and may be held in an ESOP trust until the employee retires or leaves the company. Here in the US, we have over 6,000 ESOP companies. There's like many local examples, most notably Niagara Gear, which is like a gear manufacturer on the west side here. The Small Business Administration offers loans to help with transitions to ESOPs, and a number of local law firms specialize specifically in transition services for companies interested in ESOPs. You can learn more about ESOPs by visiting the National Center for Employee Ownership at nceo.org or esopinfo.org. That's ESOPinfo.org. Has there been any recent research done on employee ownership? I'm sure there has. I just don't know off the top of my head. But if you go to those websites, that like they have like a ton of info on ESOPs. An EOT or employee ownership trust is very similar to. Sorry, the next slide. Next slide. Yeah, there we are. An EOT or employee ownership trust is very similar to an ESOP, but additionally, these are designed to preserve the business for the long term. Whereas ESOPs have a fiduciary responsibility to shareholders to maximize the financial benefit, which makes this means that it makes the company vulnerable to buyouts. So, sorry, my cat's like trying to eat my mouse. EOTs have a democratic decision-making process built in and are designed to be owned by the employees in perpetuity. So for example, the New Belgium Brewery was an ESOP and one of the most successful examples here in the United States. But when the big corporation, big beer corporation, Kirin offered offered New Belgium a buyout, they had to accept that. It was like part of the structure that they have. If they had been structured as an EOT, as an employee ownership trust, the employees could have voted to say like, no, we want to keep going on our own. To learn more about EOTs, you can visit project.equity.org, and you can speak to the specialists there. They really know their stuff about EOTs. We're going to come back to our friend LLCs for a second here. LLCs can be employee owned as well, especially in the case of very small companies. So if there's only 1 or 2 employees and stock isn't like a role in your company, either forming an LLC or adding your current employees as owners to your existing LLC is a relatively upfront and common practice that the Small Business Administration and any number of local law firms can help you with. We really want to just highlight LLCs in particular in this discussion because this process is the simplest and most straightforward employee ownership model to pursue. We're going to talk about a little bit more in a second here. LLCs are also used by cooperative businesses as well. So I will hand it now back to Michael.
Thanks, Bridge. So those were several employee ownership models. We at Cooperation Buffalo we're Cooperation Buffalo, not ESOP Buffalo. We tend to like worker cooperatives in particular as maybe the most most in line with our values in terms of what business structure looks like. So I'm going to go into the cooperative as one form of employee ownership. The most important difference between worker cooperative and other forms of employee ownership is the inclusion of democracy in the workplace. So like Bridge said before with the example of New Belgium, while the employees technically owned the business, they didn't have say over they didn't have effective control of the business. So the workers were limited in their actual authority, in their actual agency, in what happened at their workplace. So in cooperatives, the difference is that a cooperative is an entity designed to meet the common economic, social, and cultural needs and aspirations of its members. And so how this manifests in a worker co-op is that workers get to decide what their needs and aspirations are and set out to meet it for themselves. Co-ops are defined as being member-owned, member-controlled, and member-benefiting. Co-ops can be incorporated in several ways, including in New York State, there's a specific subclass of corporations called a T Corp, which is how several co-ops are incorporated. However, LLCs can function as a worker co-op, and this is especially useful for really small local cooperative businesses who want to be worker owned. They will incorporate as LLCs for all of the reasons that Bridge described earlier. So there are several different types of co-ops, different types of cooperative businesses. Worker co-ops, like I explained, in worker co-ops, the workers are the members of the co-op, and it's a situation where the people who are working in the business have say of it, but there are also other types of cooperative businesses. The first one is a consumer co-op. So the Lexington co-op in Buffalo is an example of this. It's where the folks who use the co-op as buyers, as consumers, are the ones that own it. So all the members of the Lexington co-op, as an example, have ownership shares and they vote on the board of directors, and in that way it's democratic. There are producer co-ops. You see a lot of farms and agricultural co-ops be producer co-ops. It's where you have several different individual businesses work together in cooperation with each other. And then finally, there's what's known as the multi-stakeholder or solidarity model of co-op. And this is a really interesting model where it's a co-op that has the features of multiple types of co-ops in one business. So an example of this would be a food co-op that is consumer owned and worker owned, where there's two different types of membership shares. One is for the workers who own it, and then one is for the consumers that own it. And there are several examples of these around the country. So how do cooperative economies operate? I'll give a few examples to start. So there's the evergreen cooperative model. And in this model, you have an entire cooperative economy working where you have a worker-owned co-ops that produce, you have consumer co-ops that have different types of businesses, and they work together with local governments and other democratic institutions like school boards to democratically control the entire economy. Another impact of cooperative economies is that co-ops are often response to crises situations. So some examples of these are in Spain in the 50s, there was a severe economic downturn. And in response to that, a cooperative was started called Mondragon, which became so successful, it now has hundreds of thousands of workers in different companies all under the same co-op. Similarly, in Argentina in the early 2000s, there was a crisis brought on by a lot of capital flight, specifically financial capital flight out of the country, and a lot of businesses were shut down, and so a bunch of workers got together and reclaimed the factories that were shut down, and there are over 300 reclaimed factories then that are still active today. And so cooperative economics and cooperative businesses have been shown in different places to be adaptable and resilient during economic downturns. And it is my contention that we can replicate this in Buffalo now, because we are currently, of course, in an economic crisis brought on by COVID. So I wanted to talk for just a minute about co-ops during COVID. So how would a cooperative business respond to what's happening right now? Well, for example, co-ops will decide, the workers will get together and say to themselves, is it safe for us to be working in the conditions that we're currently working in? And because they have a say over their own health and well-being, they'll make decisions that don't put them in more risk than they need to be in. Another example is workers will decide who among their staff to lay off and why, or they may vote to reduce their pay and keep their coworkers employed, or maybe they reduce their hours and keep everyone employed. So again, it's an example of a business where because the workers own it, they won't do things that will affect them negatively. And like I said, co-ops are historically more resilient during downturns and therefore maybe less likely to suffer closing because of COVID in particular. Okay, so that was a lot of information. Does anyone have any questions? We're about to move into a breakout.
I have a quick question. Hi, Fernando, LA Co-op Lab here in Los Angeles. And my question is around that last bullet point that you laid out in terms of co-ops being more historically resilient during downturns. Like, what makes a co-op more resilient during downturns? What about them makes them special and different from traditional businesses? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I would say that there are a lot of reasons. I think one is that because they're more embedded in their communities, there's more purchase in the stakeholders in the community to keep the business open. You have not only the internal democratic practices within the workplace of workers getting together and deciding, what's the best thing we can possibly do right now, but also you often see them as embedded in not only just the community of other cooperative businesses, but also just in general, a community that cares more about whether they sink or swim. Does anyone else on the panel have anything to add to that?
I think that's exactly right. I think, interestingly, some of the data that folks like the NCEO collect on co-ops, but also just all forms of employee-owned companies, also points to fewer layoffs in particular, in general, from employee-owned companies, whether during crisis or not, because folks are more invested in keeping each other's wealth protected and their jobs protected. And I think that's a major one, right? Like a co-op's going to pivot in some ways that are not necessarily profit-driven, but are people-driven instead in times of crisis.
Cool. I also open the floor. Does anyone else have any thoughts about that question? Okay. Great. Well, thank you, Fernando. So all right, so we're gonna move to a breakout group, and I will pass it to Bridge to explain.
I was on mute there. Okay. So I think, Andrew, are we going to do breakouts? Like, you were.
Yes, we are going to do breakouts. There was a minor tech problem, but it's resolved.
Okay. Yeah, so we're going to break folks out into groups of like 3 to 4 people. The questions, like that we'll be going over, like you can see them right there. I'm just going to copy and paste also the link again to the shared Google Doc. So let me just put this back in the chat. So you can also open that up and have that, like you can everybody can like feel free to like type away into this document as well. So yeah, Questions, it's going to be introductions. Then how has COVID impacted you personally, economically, and how has it affected our region economically? What needs are presently unaddressed that could be addressed with worker or community-owned institutions? What businesses do you worry we might lose during this crisis? And is worker or community ownership a solution possibly in these instances? And what transitions might there be? What barriers might there be to transition? Then we'll come back together as a big group, and we'll just chat amongst like the big group about like things we discussed. So take it away, Andrew. Okay, I think everybody's back now. So yeah, do folks from like the group 2 or room 2 want to speak first? Like what you talked about and like what you came up with. I see Anonymous Wombat is still typing a little bit on the Google Doc.
That would be me. I'm trying to break out everyone's thoughts. So we kind of just really got an opportunity to introduce ourselves and then started talking about how COVID-19 has affected us personally over the last 4 or 5 months. By the way, hi everyone, I'm Trish. I see a few faces that I know. So really quickly, what we said was that that everything basically changed for her and her family because of layoffs, that there was definitely a drop in income, and basically the reliance on, employment or unemployment for basic everyday needs and to be able to maintain those needs. But not as but personally, she wasn't as personally affected. But she knew people within her community that had been personally affected, not receiving the type of help from the stimulus that they were looking for, or from unemployment. It took, several weeks or months for the stimulus or the help to come through. Kendra, I believe, Kendra, sorry. Additionally, basically, had not been as personally affected, but definitely received lots of support from her community. The one reason that she's really joining this call is because she wants to know how she can help to support staff personnel who part-time and full-time who may have been laid off, and how she can support her community in order to overcome this crisis. So that's one of the things that we talked about. And then I talked about personally being a parent in COVID-19 to a child that is, abruptly taken from school, that, is wondering why they can't play with their friends, why they can't go outside, why we can't go to the store. That really has been trying. And then just trying to maintain a work-life-home balance while being a teacher, it was very trying for us. Personally, it didn't financially affect us, but emotionally, it definitely was very taxing. So we kind of just got through the first question and then had to come back. So that's as far as we got.
Do you have any thoughts on like the other questions? Like you just you off the top of your head?
Absolutely. So just what needs are presently unaddressed. So I think that one of the things that's unaddressed right now is within communities of color, because we know that with COVID-19, communities of colors were predominantly affected. I don't believe there's enough of a presence or education out there about really what is going on in our communities and how to seek and get help. I think that there are institutions available, like for instance, one of our members in our group has a holistic, she's a Reiki healer, looking at different ways, using her organization as an example. There are plenty of other ways to help people heal, from everything from traumatic grief, loss, and things of that nature, which our entire community has gone through. And I don't think that there's anything available really for people, communities of color, people in general, to have access to. So finding an organization that really can help to address those needs within the community, how to deal with loss, how to deal with grief during this time of COVID-19 is, I think, one of the things that will allow us to build our communities back better. The businesses that I believe we may lose during this crisis is really going to be your small businesses, your mom and pop shops that were, you know, 2 customers away from closing the doors, but struggling to keep the doors open. With such a abrupt closing of our economy, I feel like those businesses are going to have the hardest time reopening, not only because they don't have the customers, but also those big dollars that were allocated to banks to distribute to small businesses that need it. I don't think they went where they needed to go. And I know that with a lot of small businesses, they're still waiting for funding. They're still waiting for some type of bailout to keep their doors open, to bring back their employees and that sort of thing. So personally, I think that we are going to lose a lot of the mom and pop shops, you know, the bodega on the corner, the little clothing boutique down the street, those type of businesses, I think we are not going to see come back, or if we do see come back, it's not going to be under the same ownership. So that's what I got.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Can we, how about the other group? Do we have folks from that group who want to speak?
Is that our group? I can't see.
Whichever room 3 was.
Yeah, I think that was our group.
Well, yeah, we skipped kind of down to the last question, and we're trying to think about like barriers to transitions. And yeah, I think we sort of thought of a lot of those, especially now, and trying to think like, well, first of all, you know, sort of here, because I guess I don't, it's kind of like the unknown unknowns. I'm not sure what barriers I don't know about that I want to be thinking about and trying to kind of imagine, thinking about a transition. And just since the emphasis is we're just talking about is how, you know, especially the really small businesses with very few employees or no employees except the owners are what are most vulnerable, and we're already, you know, kind of barely squeaking by before COVID hit. You know, what, like, can a worker co-op model be something that can step in that type of situation, like for a business that isn't maybe already unionized or doesn't already have a group of employees who could easily step into that role, right? Thinking about being people coming from the outside who have an interest in seeing a particular business or service survive. Mm-hmm. But then it seems like in addition to trying to transition to a worker co-op, you're also trying to scale up to make the business viable for more people. And that seems like a real big, one of the largest barriers that sort of we were knocking our heads over. Sorry if my video's not on, let me see. Oh yeah, there we go, sorry. Hi.
Yeah, that was like my biggest thing too. We wrote down some other stuff about like agreeing on the value of the business if you're taking it over from another person. You know, thinking about customer loyalty if there's a changeover, whether the business is currently viable, those kinds of things. But yeah, I think that kind of covers it.
Yeah, thank you. Does anyone else want to share like any thoughts from either of the groups?
I mean, for the region, obviously, hospitality is a big deal because there's, you know, Niagara Falls, travel, you know, Canada. As far as industries that are affected, that's certainly one of the big ones as well.
Definitely.
And the theaters, the arts.
Okay. At this point, I think I'm going to pass it on to Andrew, who's going to talk to us more about they have like the entire part of this that's all about cooperatives and transition work, and yeah, so I'm going to pass it to them now. Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Bridge. Yeah, so I'm going to shift gears a little bit and actually walk us through what the process of transitioning a business or converting a business to worker ownership can look like. Because as I was hearing just from your breakout discussion, some of those questions were coming up, right? Like, how does this work? What are the things I don't know about how this process happens? And what are some of like the challenges that come up all the time in these sorts of things, let alone the unique challenges of this moment of the economic crisis due to COVID, right? And before I do that, I just wanted to comment a little bit on what folks were saying about both those types of businesses that are really struggling due to the pandemic right now, and also that question of like viability, right? Like that's something that we think about a lot in terms of picking good candidates for conversion to worker ownership. Like, is this business making money? Is it going to make wealth for the workers if they take it over and own it? And in this moment of the pandemic, that question is much more complicated, right? Because all these businesses are closed or shut down, not bringing in the kind of customers that they would normally want. And maybe most of their workers are furloughed or laid off or benefiting from the extra unemployment checks that are here currently, but might not be very soon. The question is a little bit more complicated than just, is this a viable business right now? It's like, well, in a world past this moment, will it be viable? And if the owners are thinking of just throwing up their hands, can we hang on to it for a minute, get the workers through unemployment and through whatever extra supports they need, so that on the other side of this, they could just own it, right? And so we're sort of like preserving it for that future moment rather than preserving it for making money for folks right now, because that can be impossible. So I just wanted to like add that wrinkle to the discussion. Okay, so on the screen are a set of 5 overarching steps that we use when we walk a business through this process. These are taken from a national organization called the Democracy at Work Institute, kind of adapted for us. And there's a collaborative of small cooperative development organizations like us around the country that use this similar model to talk to business owners who might be thinking about selling, to sort of orient them to a common process. So the first stage is this exploration, really figuring out if this is something that the seller wants to pursue. Then there's an assessment stage where we start to do some actual like financial feasibility, operational management feasibility, to see if this business, when you look at the details, is actually going to work through the transition. Then if those things come back okay, we move on into a phase called structure here, where actually the deal is structured. We figure out what the sale price is going to be. We start to plan out what the changes are going to be, who's going to take on the responsibilities of the selling owner, that sort of thing. Then there's the moment when the transaction actually happens, the complete stage, which you'd think is just really quick because it's signing paperwork, but there can be a lot of back and forth between lawyers and making sure that the loan documents, if there's a loan involved for the purchase of the business, are all lined up. And then, importantly, there's a whole chunk of work that starts after the transition technically happens, where ideally a brand new co-op that is worker owned is going to need some extra support to make that transition, to build that ownership culture amongst people that used to just clock in and clock out as workers, and adapt and pivot to being business owners for the first time. And so that's a part where to us, it's a whole part of the process. It's not just getting them to transition and then wishing them good luck. It's actually working with folks through this entire thing. Let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to use really briefly as a case study a business on Buffalo's west side called the Rose Garden Early Childhood Center that we helped convert to worker ownership 2.5 years ago now. So the Rose Garden has 16 employees, full-time equivalent. It's a child care center, so folks take their children to the Rose Garden for the day. There was an initial founder who owned the business for about 8 years before the transition started, who wanted to retire, was of retirement age, was of the silver tsunami baby boomer generation, and wanted the business to continue, wanted her legacy to continue. And she actually thought that selling it to the teachers was a good idea, so she had this idea. And a starting group of 5 of the teachers at the Rose Garden became the new owners, with a path for all the remaining workers to become worker owners too. So here's those 5 steps again, but with some detailed information for what this looked like specifically for the rose garden. So that exploration phase, in this case, actually took about a year, really just because we were lining up with the owner's exit strategy for herself. She wanted to work at the business for a certain amount of time and wanted to thoroughly research the idea before she agreed to move on. The assessment stage took about 6 months. We were actually doing that deep dive into the financials and into the organizational structure of the business and starting to train up the incoming worker owners to think like owners. The structuring of the deal took another 6 or 7 months, where we actually assembled a transition team that I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute that worked together to come up with a plan for how to do it and made sure that this happened. Then the closing of the sale and all the loan documents took about 3 months, and they transitioned in December of 2017. And we're a couple of years into this support phase now where we continue to provide ongoing technical assistance as necessary and are supporting the worker owners to make sure that they're paying back the loan that they took out roughly on time so that they can own the business outright once they've paid off the seller. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to walk through each of those stages a little bit more in depth just to give you a sense of what this really looks like. So the owner of the Rose Garden approached Cooperation Buffalo just seeking general resources on employee ownership and asking, could this work? We provided some case studies, some examples of other childcare centers that are co-ops or had transitioned to be co-ops across the country. And yeah, we actually scheduled some Zoom calls so they could talk to her about what their experience was like as co-op childcares. And we helped the owner think about how best to use outside technical assistance providers. They worked with the Small Business Development Center on more sort of general questions about the transition, and also with some specialists in co-ops and in selling a business to pinpoint how much the business was worth. And yeah, and like I mentioned, this stage lasted about a year. Let's go to the next slide. So that second stage, the assessment stage, the owner paid for a valuation of the business so that she could get an independent assessment of how much the company was worth. This was a TA provider called the ICA Group that specializes in co-ops, and they were willing to do this initial financial feasibility for us as a part of the puzzle. The owner then officially contracted with Cooperation Buffalo to do some of the pre-sale work to get the business lined up so that it would be in a healthy state for the transition. We started engaging the workers once the owner was committed to the process. And we did some team building exercises amongst the initial crop of teachers that were going to become the first owners to learn about their skills and experience and that sort of thing. And we met one-on-one with everybody to really get their opinions on what was going on inside the business and what it needed for this to be successful. Next slide. So then we got into the structure stage where we assembled a transition team, like I mentioned. And this team consisted of those initial 5 worker owners who were on track to become the first owners of the co-op. And we also included there is a unique position at this business where someone's in a management role, which is actually kind of dictated by the rules of the Office of Child and Family Services at New York State. There needs to be someone at a child care called the director. And so this person kind of serves as a manager. And that role was going to continue at the business, but we still wanted that person's input as well. She wasn't going to be one of the initial worker owners, but she's still a key employee to make sure this business is successful. And then the selling owner obviously had veto power throughout this process because it was still her business. But she let this transition team start to develop some of the policies and procedures for what this was going to look like moving forward. And then the seller actually let the transition team practice being a board of directors for several months and making their own decisions at the business before the sale happens, so that we could kind of tweak and pivot if we needed to and feel really confident that they were ready when the transition happened. And then the transition team worked with us and a national lender that we're a member of called Seed Commons to put together a loan package for the sale of the business. I'll talk more about that in just a minute. One of the things we did that I like to highlight in this stage of the game was we asked all of the incoming worker owners to self-reflect on how confident they felt at some of the standard skills you need in order to be a business owner. And this went into like, do you have experience doing strategic planning or record keeping? Do you have experience doing some management responsibilities so that you could like properly oversee the manager who was one of the other employees at this business? Do they have experience doing budgeting or financial analysis and things like that? And this helped us figure out what we needed to train folks on. And it also helped folks to figure out what roles they might want to naturally fall into as they share the workload of being the board, being the folks that oversee this company. Not everybody needed to be really good at all these things. If someone had some financial experience, they would be a really good fit to be the treasurer of the co-op, at least at first, while other folks built up those skills. We also had the selling owner do this for each of the incoming worker owners too, her assessment of where their strengths might lie. Let's go to the next slide. Transition plan, right? So that transition team developed a detailed plan, which actually looks a lot like a business plan, but it's a targeted business plan for this type of transition moment. So it was a specific work plan for the tasks that the selling owner used to do at the business and who was going to take those on and how those pieces were going to be transitioned. And we really parsed those out. The seller, in this case at the Rose Garden, was doing a lot of marketing and PR work, was doing a lot of kind of just like morale boosting and management of other folks at the business, and was also doing some of like the financial oversight. And so we teased out those tasks and found folks to take them on, trained them up if it was needed, and worked on this plan collaboratively with the incoming worker owners. Let's go to the next slide. So in this stage, like I mentioned, we also put together financing for the deal because the seller, who was of retirement age and wanted to get out of this business, also wanted to earn something back for all of the labor that she had put into making this business successful. And the business would be in the market out there theoretically worth something. So as I mentioned, we figured out a valuation of the business. The seller actually in this case decided to sell for less than what that valuation came in at a little bit because she was so committed to this working. And we sought out financing from this organization called Seed Commons that we are a member of. Seed Commons is actually a national cooperative of loan funds like Cooperation Buffalo that gives out what they call non-extractive capital. And basically what that boils down to is it's loans, but they're loans that don't follow any, well, possibly a few, but very few of the traditional terms you would see from commercial lenders or even from community development financial institutions or other CDFIs that are out there on the market. So this non-extractive capital doesn't look at folks' credit scores. They don't look at a certain like collateral mix. No one is required to make a personal guarantee on the loan. And instead of that, the security for the loan really is the strong relationship that the co-op has with folks on the ground, us, to make sure that they're going to have a guide through this whole process and ensure that they can actually be a sustainable enterprise. And as a side effect of working with them really hard to make sure that this business is sustainable, they're going to have the money to be able to pay back the loan. The loans are also variable payment in this case. So if the business has a really good year, they're going to make a larger loan payment. If they have a year where they're just barely going to break even or actually lose money, like what 2020 is shaping up to be for most small businesses, they're not going to make a loan payment this year, which is a really great way to think about how to lend debt to folks. Let's see, is there anything else I want to say about this? No, I think that covered it. So then we got to the stage where we actually completed the deal and signed paperwork. It involved several versions of the closing documents based on attorneys on both sides going back and forth. As part of the closing, the Rose Garden officially amended its certificate of incorporation. So remember earlier when we were talking about the different legal ways you can set up a cooperative, LLCs being a very common way to do it. In this case, the Rose Garden was already set up as a corporation. So we picked the path of least resistance. It allowed the Rose Garden to keep its license as a childcare center because it was the same corporate entity. And we just tweaked the corporate documents a little bit so that it would be structured as a worker cooperative corporation rather than just a normal business corporation. So that transition looked like the seller actually elected all the new worker owners to the board. Then that board officially purchased the company from the selling owner and purchased her share back. And then they were the only shareholders left of the company. So as soon as those papers were signed, the new worker owners held their first annual meeting of the full membership, which consisted of 5 of them at that point. And they held their first board of directors meeting because corporations all have a board as part of their legal structure. So that they could set up some of the things and start conducting themselves as a co-op. let's go to the next one. So then we get to that last stage, the support stage, which we anticipate will be 3.5 years for the Rose Garden. And really that's based on how long it's going to take them to pay back that non-extractive loan that we got from Seed Commons. Because part of the deal is that we're with them through the entire process until they're fully repaid. And at that point, hopefully really a sustainable company that can stand on its own. So this includes different things for different companies. For the Rose Garden specifically, we did a lot of training in how to hold board meetings and what their responsibilities as board members are to the company. We do quarterly financial reviews. And actually we do this monthly with them sometimes, where we look at their profit and loss statement compared to the budget that we developed together at the beginning of the year, just to kind of monitor the financial health of the company. We help them create a budget every year for the business to project out what they're expecting to do. We always look for opportunities for professional development. Some of the worker owners have attended cooperative conferences held by the US Federation of Worker Co-ops and other groups like that, so they can meet other folks that are doing this crazy thing along with them. And then random other support as needed. So in this moment of coronavirus, we've had a lot of extra meetings with them, trying to help them through some of the pivoting, deciding how to close down, how and when to reopen, and things like that. And how to apply for some small grants and funding that can help to support them and keep them afloat right now. So also part of the loan terms, this was in those documents that were signed, the selling owner agreed to stick around and not just like go on vacation and never be heard from again. And she's available to provide mentorship to the new worker owners if they want to use it. And we certainly engaged her a lot more on that the first year. And moving forward, they've been able to stand on their own 2 feet really well and haven't had to reach out for much support, which is awesome. Next slide. Okay, and so this is where I'm going to close this section. These are 3 questions that, again, come from the Democracy at Work Institute and this collaborative of folks across the country that are all working to push this idea of conversions as a lot of baby boomer businesses retire. And these are 3 really good prompts for folks maybe on this call or folks that you know who are small business owners out there who might be reaching that point where they don't want to do it anymore. If these things come back with a yes, it's a particularly good fit for this sort of model. So I want the positive impacts I've built into my business, good jobs, connection to the neighborhood or the community, best practices to last beyond my time as the owner. So that's really tapping into that. I want to preserve my legacy piece. I believe the risks and rewards of ownership can reinforce a culture of high quality work and shared responsibility that improves productivity and the bottom line. It's certainly way better when a business owner understands the benefits of the worker owner model. It's not necessarily a bad thing if they have to be convinced on that a little bit or they hear about it for the first time, but if they already get it and agree, it's a good thing. And then lastly, they want to receive a fair value for the sale of their business and think that the employees buying the business might actually value the company as much or more than other buyers. Often what happens with small businesses, especially small businesses that have assets like manufacturing companies, when they try to sell using a broker or something like that, their best buyer and their highest price is coming from someone who's just going to liquidate the business and sell the assets and obviously get rid of all the jobs. And it might be that employees are willing to pay a little bit more than that person who's just going to liquidate the business because it's going to keep them building wealth for years to come as workers and as owners. So I'm going to pause there. One question in the chat that Michael put in is the chart for matching skills to new roles publicly available. We can certainly share that with everybody in the follow-up email after this call. So I think I'm going to turn it back over to Bridge to close us out with a couple slides, and then we'll go to questions. So if you have questions about this, just hold them for a minute.
Yes. There we go. Yeah, so we're gonna just start to wrap up and then we'll do the Q&A. I just want to take a second to point out that Preservation Buffalo Niagara is currently engaged in a consumer and stakeholder survey about Grant Street for residents of the West Side. So you mentioned early on Rotundo's Laundry and Nick's Barbershop. Those are legacy businesses that were on Grant Street, had been there for 50 years. And they've recently closed, and there's like a few other businesses along those lines. They're legacy businesses that are looking at closing, within the next few years. So if that's something that you have personal interest in, we really want to hear your opinions about that. the websites are right there, and I'm just going to copy and paste those to the chat. So if you want to, like, yeah, and we'll also send these links out later. So let me just copy and paste that there, and copy and paste that there. Yeah. So if you have any time to take those surveys, we'd really appreciate it. And I'm going to pass it over to Michael to talk about the Co-op Academy.
Thank you. So yeah, if you are serious, if this sounds good to you and you're serious about starting a co-op or converting your traditional business to a co-op, Cooperation Buffalo is offering a free, comprehensive 13-week course to help you do it. We cover business and financial planning, democratic governance, and as well as co-op's place in the movement for a solidarity economy and a lot more. And that's going to be happening on Tuesday nights, and with everything else, including the slides and other information, we will send out information about this in the next few days. And that is all we have in terms of programming. Because we delivered so much just information to you all and talked a lot, I wanted to open up the floor just to questions about any of the content we covered for the next 10 minutes or so, if there are any questions or anything.
And don't forget to unmute yourself if you're trying to talk.
Right. Oh, is anyone talking? Hello?
Yep.
Oh, all right, cool. Yeah, well, just curious also, I mean, looking at different models for things, like wondering if you have any thoughts or resources for kind of considering a worker co-op model versus like transitioning something into a nonprofit, or is that kind of outside of your wheelhouse, or just kind of an open-ended question there?
I can potentially field that. The decision to build something as a nonprofit corporation versus any type of for-profit, whether it's a co-op or just a regular single person business or partnership or something like that, often comes down to where the revenue is going to come from. If you're selling a product or service where you're going to have customers pay for it, it's probably gonna work as a co-op or as a for-profit business. But if a good chunk of your income is going to be grants or donations or that sort of thing, because of all of the tax advantages built into the tax exempt code for nonprofits, it really makes sense to structure things as nonprofits when a majority of your revenue is gonna look like that. So I think that's like your first like threshold to get through. And then if you figure it out, oh no, this is a for-profit business, then I think you just have the decision of like, do these aspects of democratic ownership, joint control, ability for all the workers to participate in the big picture direction of the business. If all those things are check boxes for you too, then co-op is probably a good fit. Does that help?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, thanks.
I just would add that not-for-profit doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be like a like it can't have democratic elements to it. You can definitely start a good not-for-profit and have your workers like as part of the ownership. So yeah, I just wanted to add.
Thanks, Bridge.
Other questions or thoughts that folks have before we close out?
In terms of taking like the 13-week course, you said like, you know, if you're serious about this, are you ready to commit? Like if we're serious about continuing, like can the seminar still be like a really way to really dive into that first stage of kind of research and exploring? Or is it like, should we not take it unless we're 100% committed to it? Versus a nonprofit.
Could you repeat the last thing?
yeah, like versus like taking the seminar if we're still kind of unsure about like the nonprofit versus the worker co-op model. Like, would we still be a good candidate for the seminar as a way to like really deep dive into exploring like what it takes to do the worker co-op model? Like, we'd still be good enrolling in that, or should we stay away?
Yeah. No, I recommend it if you're still in the research stage. Most of the folks who have currently applied are in the research stage. What we do, our ultimate goal of the academy is to prepare folks to open a cooperative business, either open it or convert it. While you are thinking about co-ops and nonprofits, there are some cooperatives that have a nonprofit component to them while being generally a for-profit business. And I'm going to find some examples and I'll put it in the email that goes out to folks. But I do encourage you, if you have any co-op aspirations to be a part of the cohort, I think you'd have a lot to learn from it.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks.
Jumping off of that, how does the Co-op Academy, how is that process different than the kind of mentorship that you just described with like Rose Garden, for instance?
I can take that. The Academy is 13 weeks, 2 hours a week on Tuesday evenings. So there's only so much that can happen in that space. So it's kind of it's a deep dive into all of those different aspects of what is a co-op, building a business plan. We'll actually go through the exercise. There'll be homework involved along the way where you'll be building a really basic business plan and financial plan for the business and give some sort of pitch of your business concept when it's a little bit more formed by the end of the course. But it's really meant to get folks from that stage of, I've got a team, we want to do this, we don't know what to do first. And by the end of it, you'll feel like you know what the steps are and you know what to do, but you won't have completed them all yet. And often what happens, we did this with the cohort of folks last year, several of the teams from that academy then will apply with us to become projects that we incubate more closely and have a longer term relationship with. So it's kind of a chance for folks to like test out working together as a team, get somewhere with the process. But you know, it certainly happens so fast, you won't also be at the same time like putting together legal documents and all that quite yet. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
We have time for a few more if anyone has any other questions.
I guess it's, to me, it's like if you already have a business that you know you want to target, it's probably a heck of a lot easier than if you're looking at businesses to help transition. But with that in mind, when you talk about, you know, these legacy businesses that are phasing out, or like, you know, if there's an idea for a business, but you don't, I don't have expertise in certain things, but I bring certain things to the table. So putting together that initial group, it just seems kind of daunting, especially with that timeline of like, oh my God, that takes a long time to do this. Is it going to be viable? So I'm just wondering, I don't know if you can offer any insight into that.
Well, what I'll say to that is that, so that example of the Rose Gardens timeline, right, where it was a couple of years and then they transitioned a couple of years after a follow-up support, that timeline can vary. I've seen conversions happen as quickly as like 3 to 6 months where all the paperwork lined up and folks kind of rushed into it. And I've seen it also take 5 to 10 years where they start talking about it, but the owner isn't going to be retiring for a period of time. So there's a lot of these careful steps that are taken to really make sure it's like the easiest transition possible when it finally happens. When you're talking about a startup, your timeline also is going to look very different because you're not always afforded the time to plan and wait for a really long time before you start making money and start trying to push toward being a profitable business. So a lot of the startups that we work with, we'll often encourage them to take the lean startup or minimum viable product approach, where like, how quickly can you test your co-op idea, start selling a product or service, get some detail back from your customers if it's working or not, and keep iterating on that and growing slowly. So there's a lot of small steps that actually involve starting the co-op and doing the co-op thing right away, especially in that sort of startup model. With the transition of an existing business, the business model is pretty well set unless you're going to change anything substantial. So it's really just about lining up all the ducks to make sure that we can switch it over okay.
All right, well, I think we can end it there. I want to thank you all again for joining us this evening. Please feel free to reach out to any of the three of us if you have any questions about what we covered this evening. And by the end of the week, I will send out an email with these slides and the other information that we've spoken about. I highly encourage you to attend the Academy if it would be relevant and good. And otherwise, I hope to see you all soon. I hope everyone has a great night.